Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to today's seminar or symposium on examining intersectionalities of automated decision-making and race ethnicity. My name is Paul Henman. I'm from the University of Queensland and part of the Australian Research Council's Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society. This event has been organised by that centre, and so I want to acknowledge the Australian Research Council. This has been a wonderful symposium. I've been waiting all year to be able to hold it, so I'm here ready to learn, and I hope everybody else is here. It's been set up as a Zoom meeting, so please make sure you've got your microphones off. Apart from our panel members, and there will be plenty of time at the end of the presentations to engage with our esteemed colleagues. So before we begin, I want to hand over the welcome to country to Willie Pepper. Willie Pepper is representing the Boonwurrung Land and Sea Council. He comes from Victoria and he's located The welcome to country is based there, even though we're meeting from all different places, because that is the location of RMIT, the home of the base for the Centre for Automated Decision Making in Society. So I'll hand it over to you, Willie.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yes, my name is William Pepper. I am a Gunai Kurnai man. My father was born on an Aboriginal mission down at Lake Tyers. My mother is Yorta Yorta, being born up at Cumragunja on the border between Victoria and New South Wales, up near Shepparton. I will commence. Wominjeka. As a representative of the Boonwurrung, Melbourne's First Peoples, I am pleased to be able to welcome you all here this morning on behalf of Nawit, Carol and Briggs, to this Intersectionalities of Automotive Decision-Making and Race Ethnicity event. I would like to pay my respect to the Boonwurrung ancestors and elders, past, present, and emerging, and to acknowledge all of you who are meeting on different lands. We are especially pleased to recognise the commitment the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society at RMIT University has made in paying respect to the spirit of this land and its first peoples. Through this, you've shown the willingness to honour sacred ground. It is important for all Victorians and Australians, apparently all around our nation, to understand and appreciate the history and culture of the Indigenous people of Melbourne, who have played a significant role in the development of Melbourne, both before and after European arrival, as they're unknown to many people who live on this beautiful land. The struggle to preserve their culture and traditions began with the ancestors back in the 1830s. One of the lessons we should take from this struggle is the way in which the elders and leaders forged alliances that led to many of the achievements that we take for granted today. And as Australians, whilst we may have all descended from different clans and language groups and countries from across the world, we can all learn from this lesson. The word welcome in Boonwurrung is Wominjeka, and it translates to come with purpose. It is a contract between the people as the custodians of this land and yourselves to ensure our laws are adhered to and to guarantee safe passages for those who ask. According to tradition, this land has always been protected by the creator Bunjil, who travels as an eagle, and by Warn, who protects the waterways and travels as a crow. Bunjil taught the Boonwurrung people to always welcome guests but he always required the JiaBin Huang to ask all visitors to make two promises that I will ask of you this morning: to obey the laws of Bunjil and not to harm the children or the land of Bunjil. This commitment was made through the exchange of a small bow dipped in the water and the words spoken, woman Jekka. Thank you for your time, and good luck with your day.
Thank you very much, Willie Pepper, for your welcome and warm welcome to country and to our event. We appreciate your presence and your welcome.
Okay, Paul, thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Of course, Willie has just welcomed us to country, but I think it's also important for non-Indigenous people to acknowledge the traditional owners on where we all sit in and we're joining us in this event. We pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants and recognise their continuing cultural and spiritual connections to the land. We recognise this once was and always will be Indigenous land and has never been acceded. So for today, I just want to begin by, we've done our acknowledgements. We are recording this event and only the recording will occur for the front presentations. The discussion will not be recorded. So we'll have about 25 minutes with Safira U. 10 minutes Bronwyn Carlson will engage with Safira's conversation and also talk a bit about her work. And Dr. Karaitiana Taiuru will also be speaking from New Zealand. That leaves us about 30 minutes for questions and discussions. As I already acknowledged, this event has been held by the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making. Was established last year as a cross-disciplinary project centre to create knowledge and strategies necessary for responsible, ethical and exclusive automated decision making. This is the first of a number of events looking at the intersectionalities of automated decision making and society, and really pleased to begin with the questions of race and ethnicity. I think it's well known for most people who have been interested in the question of automated decision making or artificial intelligence or digital technology that there have been significant concerns raised in the past about the way in which race and ethnicity, discrimination and racist behaviours and content has been reproduced from Microsoft's Tay to more recently into the criminal justice system from the Compass system. So to engage with those questions, we've got a really great panel of internationally renowned speakers. Associate Professor Safira U does not need any introduction. Her work, Algorithms of Oppression, came out in 2018 based on work over many years. It was one of the seminal pieces of work that really structured and captured the imagination of the way in which algorithms in today's world create significant problems for discrimination, inequality, etc. So it is a real pleasure to have you here, Safira. Safira is at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she serves as the co-founder and director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. She is author of Algorithms of Oppression, but she is also contributed to as editor to the Intersectional Internet and Emotions Technology and Design. So I'll hand it over to you, Safira, and welcome you on behalf of the rest of the group.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you to all of the people who've put so much energy and time into organizing this amazing session today. I'm really so honored to be here. I'm also joining you from Los Angeles, which is truly the Gabrielino and Tonga people's land that they have not ceded. And I am both a descendant of colonized people who were brought to this land from the shores of Africa, which are not known to us in any specific way because of those journeys of our ancestors to these lands, but also a descendant of colonizers who participated in the brutality of all that we experience in North America. So I just want to say that it's I'm in solidarity with both the people who steward this land and also the people who steward the lands where this conference is being held. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity to learn and be in conversation with my co-panelists today. So let me just start by saying that I have just a handful of slides that, not very many, but just enough to kind of get us going in a bit of a conversation. And so while I'm working to get these started here, can you see just the slides and not the whole computer background too? All right, great. I think it's so important that we're having these conversations around the world in different places, in different lands, by different people, because the specifics of the way in which so many of the technologies and automated decision-making systems that we're engaging with are applied in different kinds of racial and ethnic constructs and contexts. But I also believe that the struggles to resist the way in which we are being kind of further captured and dehumanized by automated systems is some of the most important pressing civil, human, and sovereign rights in the world. And for those of us who feel compelled to respond to these concerns and to talk about these things, I just want to acknowledge how incredibly difficult it is to do that work in the face of trillions of dollars and currencies that are poured around the world by the tech sector into narratives about the liberatory possibilities and promise of these technologies. And I think that many of us in our respective communities see different things. And this is one of the reasons why scholars of race and ethnicity really must continue to be, and Indigenous studies, gender studies, sexuality really need to be at the forefront of these conversations, because I think we ask different questions coming out of the kind of historical, political, social, economic context of our work than makers of technology or people who are kind of techno solutionists or kind of embroiled in the techno utopianism. So it's from that vantage point that I'm joining this conversation with you today. So let me also share with you, because last summer in the United States, a man named George Floyd was murdered by police officers in Minnesota. And he was one of many, many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands of Black people in African Americans who have been murdered by the state or whose lives have been kind of disregarded by the state in these kind of very extremely brutal ways. And the uprising in the United States and around the world, and we are grateful for the solidarity of people around the world who still recognize the struggle of Black people in the United States, brought about kind of a moment where for us in our center at UCLA, there were many questions by people in the tech sector in particular who were even outside the specifics of their jobs, were asking about their responsibility and what they needed to know or what they should be thinking about at the intersection of race and technology. So I put this slide together kind of in memoriam of not only Mr. Floyd, but all of the scholars of color, Black scholars in particular in the United States, who've been writing at the intersection of race and technology for many years, indeed years before I was started writing about algorithms specifically. who were trying to re-narrate and animate a different set of concerns and conversations about the stakes of power and the kind of uneven ways in which power is enacted upon vulnerable people around the world and in this country. And so these are people that I just think, I invite you, if you're interested and can think about things that you can pick up from their work to take into your work. These are people that I think are working in a variety of different spaces, from sociology to Black studies, communications, computer science, African American studies, Black studies, American studies, but who are all of us who are thinking about race and power and technology. And I think that there are, and we're situated in different eras in history, but I think our work in this kind of collective body of work that's emerging, what it signals to me is that no one person is really kind of carrying all the water on all this. Together, we are trying to build a paradigm and shift a paradigm at this moment. And so I just invite you to know about these scholars as well. All right, so what are some of the stakes? And I'm really just going to contour some of the things that I think could be a bit of a frame for my colleagues to also hang more evidence upon from your work as well, to think about kind of what are the pointed ways in which we see race and ethnicity used and kind of weaponized in hierarchical power structures of control on people of color continuously in an incredibly kind of normative way that goes unquestioned. Of course, let me just definitionally say, I mean, I can't, as a Black studies professor, I need to say that these constructs around race, at least in the US context, are really, when we think about race, we're talking about a system of power. And the way that system of power in the United States works is it's a hierarchical power based on a binary. And that binary is kind of predicated upon Europeanity at the top. Also, you could think of it as kind of all the ways in which a construct of whiteness gets made and people petition to be recognized. So many people from many parts of the world who are ethnically connected to different nations or kind of ethnically defined also seek to locate their ethnicity within this racial binary of power in the United States that puts Europeanity at the top or whiteness kind of at the top, and people petitioning to be recognized through that power lens. And it relies upon Blackness, Black people, Africanness as its polar in that power structure in order to determine kind of the distribution of goods and services, who labors and who receives the benefit of labor, who is enslaved and who controls. These legacies of race as it's constructed here are really important, and they often are conflated also with ethnicity. So for me, I would say my ethnicity is being African American, a descendant of enslaved Black and African people who are not connected to a specific nation state because of the transatlantic slave trade, and our ancestors are really known to us on these lands. This is important because we have many kinds of Black people and African people in the United States, from the Caribbean, from the continent, from Europe, from all kinds of places. So when we think about race as a lens to study technology, often what we're talking about is that power system, who benefits and who loses within that power binary. And some of the most important work that points at that are things like Joy Bulwamini's work talking about in her famous study with Timnit Gebru and Deb Raji about how facial recognition, for example, is built, deployed embraced, and it doesn't recognize Black women's faces. So you can see here an example in her study, their study, where they found that kind of the efficacy of something like a facial recognition technology right out of the box from Amazon, from Microsoft, from large, multinational companies who work and develop and deploy those systems, often are made in the image of the most powerful people in our society. So you can see lighter skinned males and men in the United States are more likely to be recognized, known, understood, have those technologies perfected upon them. And Black women, darker skinned women, having the least efficacy. And this is very important because when we look at the deployment of these technologies, they are mostly pointed at Black and brown faces through things like predictive policing technologies or other kinds of surveillance technologies that get deployed into communities of color that misrecognize us. And of course, there are famous studies in the US about things like pointing facial recognition technologies at Black or African-American members of Congress, of our federal government, and the facial recognition technology marking Black Congress people as criminals, right? Matching them up with criminal database mugshots. In my own work, I have really tried to point out to numerous examples in algorithms of oppression. It's just like a study in all of the failures of different kinds of technologies. Here's one example from that book about doing a Google search in Google Images and looking for, quote, unprofessional hairstyles for work, and being fed back almost exclusively Black women with natural hair who have not straightened their hair, chemically treated our hair. I wear my hair natural 99% of the year. And so I would be one of these pictures. I could just see myself right there. And of course, then looking for professional hairstyles for work and seeing almost exclusively white women and white blonde women, right? So these kinds of systems are always interacting with and marking race and racial categories, even when they are touted as neutral, touted as simple tools, right? And these are the kinds of discourses that we hear constantly deployed around all kinds of technologies. Of course, we know that there's not only, Paul, as you mentioned, the kind of deployment of things like recidivism prediction software that determines whether you spend your life in jail or in prison or whether you're let out on bail. We also have these kind of technologies that, of matching and sorting people in and out of opportunity. And here we've had Robert Cooper, who was this gentleman in Detroit, an African-American man who had never missed a day of work, who was just like a model human being. If only we could be as good as him. And he's mismatched by a facial recognition system that, and police come and arrest him in his home in front of all of his neighbors, his 2 small children and his wife. And he's told that he has stolen a watch from a high-end store, only to see that while he is not only missing that first day of work, he is clearly not the person. His photograph is not a match in any way to the photograph, but yet the system is forced to arrest him because the system has made a match, so much of an erroneous match that the law enforcement officers do not even feel empowered to declare it a mismatch and are still compelled to arrest him and hold him. So we think about these things. I think about these things, going back a decade now. It's just so hard to believe that for 10 years I've been thinking about arguing that computer code is not only kind of a human construct, that technology is a social construct like race and gender. And we understand things like race and gender as social constructs, but it's just so difficult still to dislodge this idea that technology is somehow neutral, it's somehow apolitical, that it has no uneven application. And I take this back still to this day. I talk about the first study that I did that launched the book Algorithms of Oppression, because I still find so many egregious searches like this. In the case, for example, of doing a search on Black girls, you know, this was at a time when my daughter, who's grown now, was a tween and a middle schooler. And I was thinking about her and my nieces and just curious to see how Black girls were represented in Google search, and seeing that almost 80% of the search results that come back on Black girls back, a decade ago, were all pornography or hypersexualized. And of course, what does this mean for children, for people who are vulnerable, for people who are not the majority in the population, who can't control or influence or even use gamification strategies, who don't have the resources, can't search engine optimize, can't optimize themselves into a better state of being understood. Writing about that and studying about that for 10 years, one of the things that I've learned is that there's so many myths about what these technologies are, and so much obfuscation of how the algorithms work in large scale tech companies. But there's also something even more kind of pernicious that I think about, and that is this idea that that we will somehow solve these problems of racism and discrimination and oppression and colonization and occupation by holding a phone and tapping on a piece of glass. I mean, there's just like the ludicrous notion that we would somehow solve these problems with technology, when the technologies themselves are reticent to even take seriously the kinds of conversations we're having today. In fact, we see this in the case of Google, who recently fired our friend and colleague, Dr. Timnit Jabru, one of the scholars who worked on that gender shades study with Joy Bawamini on facial recognition. And while she was heading up, the ethical AI group, research group, and found that Google's, current products in development, kind of its new natural language processing kinds of network technology is fraught with racist and sexist bias and kind of discrimination, and also, of course, has this tremendous footprint ecologically, and will have a devastating effects for the planet in terms of its energy use. When she does the very thing that she's hired to do within the companies, she's summarily fired for not retracting her research and her paper and her findings. And so these things tell us so much about kind of the positionality of Black women in particular. And I underscore kind of the role of Black women in our field, and women of color more broadly, Indigenous women, because I've seen over and over how many women, people of color, LGBTQ plus people whose communities are in the crosshairs of so many of these different kinds of technologies, we often see the harm first, and are yet often the least believed, the least listened to, not in charge. And when we do our work, are also kind of vulnerable to firings or other kinds of pressures. So I just want to acknowledge, especially for my co-panelists today, the stakes of our work, of our shared work, the stakes of our commitment, and doing that under these kind of intense pressures that we feel in our communities. I think the other thing I want to say, I gave myself a timer, so I would be mindful of the time. One other thing that I'll just say here as I start to close is that I wrote a piece last year during COVID-19 for Noema magazine here in the US. It's a small magazine. I'm sure that you haven't seen it, but I'll tell you what's in it, which is that while these companies are kind of operating in these ways where there's kind of a resistance to engaging with the harms, and indeed we could even argue the crimes in many cases tied to a variety of these different types of technologies and companies. We also are losing kind of our public institutions and our public democratic institutions that could respond and could be strengthened as the counterweight to so many of these kind of corporatist envisionments of the world. In the U.S., where I work in California, I can tell you that I work in the kind of the flagship public university system, the University of California, and we see here we are just right down the street from all of the Silicon corridors, Silicon Valley, Silicon Beach, and these companies don't pay taxes for the most part. They offshore their profits. They gentrify neighborhoods. They skim the cream of the crop of the best thinkers and students and activists and people who, artists, people who could really help us reclaim our communities and our institutions. They use our airports, our roads, our public transportation systems, all of it, and give nothing, very little back, except more kind of extractive business models and products. And so we're also losing kind of our public goods in education, libraries, public health, public media, all the things we need through the depletion of resources into these kind of shared tax bases and spaces to help those other kinds of institutions, public institutions, flourish. And as our institutions are in crisis, and of course we really saw this during COVID-19 when Black and Latinx and Indigenous communities were so powerfully harmed by COVID-19, and our communities didn't have employer-based healthcare. I know everybody who ever talks to anyone in the US can't understand how terrible our healthcare system is. It's like a crime against humanity. Those same kind of the largesse of the resources of these companies and these industries should have gone back into the cities and the communities where they do business. Instead, what they did is, by withholding those resources and offshoring, kind of engaging in corporate tax evasion, they leave these institutions vulnerable, and then they rush in with their products and services to somehow shore up our institutions. So instead of getting funding for graduate students and for faculty and lowering the fees and the cost to go to school, we get Slack and we get Zoom licenses and we get more, more software licenses and more hardware, right? And so it's like starving society of the resources and then using that to exploit and make more commercial opportunity are the kinds of things that I think we must be thinking about and caring about too. So I'll leave it here and just say the promise was that we would get more liberation, more freedom, more connectivity, more democracy with technology and the internet. And I know, because I've been on the internet since, I'm going to say maybe 89, 88, 89, 90, 91. I've definitely been on a computer since the late 80s and been on the internet. So it's just a lot of hair dye. It's fine, leave it. But I will tell you that, these promises are so confronting, because we really have more data and technology than ever. And we also have more global social, political, and economic inequality and injustice to go with it. And I argue in my work every day that technology and data are implicated in the escalating global inequality. And we have to actually think about the role of these systems and companies in exacerbating the kinds of conditions that we're also so profoundly committed to changing. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop there and just say I'm really thrilled and excited to get to speak with you, Professor Carlson and Dr. Taiuru.
Thank you very much, Safira. It's wonderful to hear from you. And I think you've just covered some really good introduction, or really good coverage and the positioning of the whole symposium today, because the way in which you've engaged with the questions of intersectionality, you've talked about the race and ethnicity, you've talked about gender, you've talked about sexual minorities, etc., but also locate that in broader political economy of the structural significance. So thank you very much for that. I want to now turn to Professor Bronwyn Carlson. And I think the important thing that I want to bring in with this engagement about automated decision-making and race and ethnicity is the importance of Safira's work and other African Americans to demonstrate the significance of race and technology in the US is also made more complex in the experience of Indigenous people, with the significance of the connection to the land, the significance of Indigenous knowledges. And that's why we're introducing, bringing in Professor Bronwyn Carlson and Dr. Karaitiana Taiuru. And so I'm handing over to Bronwyn now. Bronwyn is an Aboriginal woman who was born and lives on Dawarl country in New South Wales, and is Professor and Head of School of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University. She's also founding and managing editor of the Journal of Global Indigeneity and the director of the Centre for Global Indigenous Futures. Bronwyn is the author of a recently released Indigenous Digital Life, the Practices, Politics and Being Indigenous on Social Media. And is also author of The Politics of Identity, Who Counts as Aboriginal Today. So with that, I will hand over to you, Bronwyn.
Thanks, Paul. I didn't have any slides because I think 10 minutes. I'll just get gone from the get-go. Thank you, Dr. Noble. I have to say that your work has been a big influence on my own, as well as a couple of others that you put up in one of your slides. Ruha Benjamin, who fabulously did a lecture for me last year in one of my classes, and of course Andre Brock's work has been quite influential, and you will find yourselves in that new publication. So I would just like to take a quick moment to acknowledge where I stand. I'm on Darawal country in Wollongong, which is south of Sydney in New South Wales. I'll just like to pay my respects to the old people, elders who've come before me, to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across this continent who continue that work, and for our future ancestors who hopefully will learn from those who've come before and think about a new world in which we'll have a different kind of world where colonialism isn't the biggest and key and most significant thing in our lives. Look, some of the stuff that you were saying, Sofiya, definitely resonates with the work that I've been doing here. So for the last 8 or 9 years, I've been working on research projects that look specifically at the everyday lives of Indigenous people here and around the world in relation to how it plays out on social media platforms specifically. And one of the things that I've found in that research, so I've gone to every state and territory within this continent that we now call Australia, and talked to people in all sorts of geographical locations. And more than 99% of those participants in my research studies have all spoken about the racism, discrimination, oppression, and violence that they've experienced online. And so to do a bit of backup for that research, I decided to take a look at media and how they report on Indigenous people and social media. And so what I found quite significantly in that over 1,500 articles that I had a look at, and encoding this archive of new media, which was specifically on Indigenous people and social media, the categories of racism, hatred, and abuse were far and away the most populated. So from police officers using Facebook profiles under fake names, to people who, had this intersectional hate of homophobia and racism towards Indigenous people, harassment, and denigrating our significant individuals who are entering into political life. So we have a number of Indigenous people, and particularly Indigenous women, who are now in the political space, where they've received death messages threats of death and threats of rape and other similar kind of messages from the Australian public. And the reason this takes place is really that they have an audacity to claim their Indigenous identity in a public way, and they have an audacity to still be here in 2021. Now, the whole way through Australian history, we can see how Indigenous people have been written out, and we're not a people who have thought of as people who will be here in the history. And I think this is really one of the key issues when we talk about technology. And I think Andre Brock points this out in their book, where they say that brown and black people are generally coded as people without technology. And so we see that same thing here in Australia. So the fact that we are actually online and participating in this digital life is a place that was never built or thought of or visioned that we'd be in it. But here we are. And so, and one of the reasons I say this, and I was thinking about when you were saying together we build and shift the paradigm, and the important work that's being done with your colleagues as well as yourself. But here in Australia, I start to think about how many Indigenous people are afforded the privilege, right, of having some research funds to be researchers of technology or Indigenous people's digital lives. And I have been very fortunate to have received 3 Australian Research Council grants that look specifically at that. I'm still one of the very few people who look at Indigenous digital lives in Australia and that intersection of technology and everyday lives. So I sit and think about that because I'm often called to talk about it, and I wonder who are the other people, like who are the other Indigenous people here who do that work? And it's so few people because they don't have funding and they don't have the privileged platform to be able to engage in the kind of research. So this stuff gets unnoticed. The kind of depth of our experiences online is largely missing from the scholarly works that's written. And it's generally the same couple of voices that get to speak on it. And then when I think about who are Indigenous people in tech industry, right? Who are part of the influencing of how this stuff operates. And so I was invited, probably because of the work that I do, to a couple of the tech companies here in Sydney. So I went along there and I was looking around at these flash buildings and all these very important people. They've got their own cafe and everything in there. It's pretty smick, and they give you lots of cool shit as you leave, fancy pens and notebooks and all the like. And there's a snack bar straight out of some sort of movie about Google or something from the US. So you go there and I say, so how many Indigenous staff do you have here? And then there's the crickets chirping. Like, what? Yeah, how many Indigenous staff do you have here? And then they tell me, I'm really committed to, building diversity within the workplace. We're really committed to Indigenous people and the lands we're on. Yeah, so right, how many Indigenous people work here, right? Well, we don't have anyone right now, but we've hired somebody to paint a mural. And I'm like, oh, awesome. And then I go through all the gates to get out, and on every gate is a black body guarding that gate. And these are all people from the US who are guarding the gates as you go through this building. So that's really interesting to me. So there are no Indigenous people that work there. And so I've been invited into these tech companies for their reconciliation breakfasts and to join their reconciliation action plan groups and all this kind of stuff. But my research and my intellectual contribution to this space is never a consideration in that. I'm invited as an Indigenous person to make a fancy document called a reconciliation action plan, which you might not have those in the US. They're a document that says this company is doing things that are culturally and respectful to Indigenous people. And they're fancy documents, and largely they're ignored. They just look good, they have a lovely dot painting on them, and so look fabulous. So there's very little happening. So then I ask other tech companies who are more interested in a pipeline of people, so more in the behind the scenes tech stuff like Google, etc. Want to, how do we create things? How do we operate algorithms, or, all of these things? So the behind the scenes stuff. And again, there are no Indigenous people. So when people talk about algorithms and bots as these are some, actual identities that are racist in and of themselves, people forget that these are actually produced by generally cisgendered men, white men, who create them in their own image. So then they go forth and create havoc and hell upon the lives of Indigenous Black and brown people. And in Australia, the most targeted groups online are Indigenous women and Indigenous LGBTQI community members. They're the most targeted, and there's an intersectional targeting based on their gender and based on their identification as an Indigenous person. So things such as facial recognition, the conversation between Black and white here is a little bit more complicated, as it is also in the US. Here, indigeneity is one of the most hated groups in these online spaces. We are targeted constantly, and it has nothing to do with how we look. It is everything to do with that audacity of speaking up and claiming to be Indigenous in 2021, when we live in a space, in a continent that has written us out of that history, that future. And so we're not welcome in this space. And so the internet has now become a hunting ground of us. And these are very real experiences of Indigenous people in these spaces. I don't know, how am I going for time, Paul? I didn't set myself a timer, sorry.
We've got about 2 minutes.
Excellent, okay. So for us, it's really difficult. So behind the scenes, all of that, where these things are built and produced and thought about are outside of our domain, outside of thinking of us being included, then the actual everyday lives of ourselves engaging on social media, particularly. And I want to just say that it's also a space that we have taken back and taken some power from, where we can come together and where we can speak to each other and where we can gather in larger numbers than ourselves and join a global network of Indigenous people. But that comes at a huge cost that Safia was talking about. That cost on our lives is huge. We see high rates of self-harm and even suicide associated with large amounts of time on social media platforms. And that's because every single day you're dealing with a hatred that is so intense in this place that it is hard for me to even explain to you what that feels like. And I've experienced that myself. And then we ask the tech giants how they can better work to ensure some sort of sense of safety of us online. And all of that work gets shipped offshore to people who have no understanding about the kinds of hatred and racism we face as Indigenous people in this country. And I'll use a really simplistic sort of explanation of that is in this country, Indigenous people are often referred to as primates, apes, as animals that would not be picked up by any kind of algorithm or any kind of program that is looking for elements of dehumanizing a particular people. So those kinds of things are not picked up. So if the regulation of these tech giants is not on, in the place in which they are producing this technology and doesn't include the people that will be most impacted, then it will continue. But the truth of it is, it's about money. It's about, it's not about our welfare. It's not about our safety, and it's not about our lives. It's about collecting clicks for money. And the more controversial that is, the more money is actually made. And so that is the bottom line of it. Humans and people who are considered others or othered in the space are not necessarily the focus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. I appreciate those insightful words and drawing on your own research about those experiences of yourself and other Australian Indigenous people. It's obviously a harrowing experience to be on that online space and try to capture that. And I thank you for sharing those words. Our last speaker is Dr. Karaitiana Taiuru. Karaitiana is interdisciplinary Maori academic and activist. He has several iwi affiliations and is originally working in the ICT industry. He has been an advocate and proponent for digital Maori rights, cultural appropriation, data sovereignty, digital colonialism, and the revitalisation with technology and Maori representation in intellectual property rights. He's recently completed his PhD thesis regarding Maori and intellectual property rights with gene technology, identifying genetic data as a taonga and a data sovereignty rights. Karaitiana is currently a research fellow at the University of Otago, Christchurch. So a welcome to you from over the ditch.
Well, thank you. First of all, just from my tribe in the South Island of New Zealand, I just want to acknowledge the Boon people, their spirits and their ancestors. It's amazing listening to my co-speakers and their stories just mirror what happens in New Zealand. It's shocking. In New Zealand, I'm privileged in the fact that I can pass off as Caucasian or as Maori, and I'm male. My female colleagues who are Maori are basically targeted, systematically targeted by white wing supremacists in encrypted chats. They basically have all their personal information gathered. They're targeted in their homes, at their workplaces. Sometimes, or more often than not, the New Zealand police can't do anything about it because there's a fine line between breaking the law and being a nuisance. A group of Māori activists in New Zealand here essentially had to create their own underground group and basically ask for funding to buy security cameras and to attend events with physical security protecting them. And I heard the comments about being online, where Māori are targeted, and especially in media articles when we talk about anything that's pro-Māori or about equity and equality. And it's, yeah, I think in the last couple of years, the hatred has just grown and grown. And probably and since COVID-19, since New Zealand's been in lockdowns this year, we've seen white supremacist groups trying to partner up with radical Māori groups or pro-Māori groups and promote through social media that Māori should not get the COVID vaccine. Yet statistically, Māori are more likely to die from that. So there's a whole lot of issues I see happening all around the world with minority peoples, and yeah, not many people. There's hard to find a solution. So just in New Zealand here, so I guess as an Indigenous peoples, we have some protections that other Indigenous peoples don't have. New Zealand has two founding documents. One is the Declaration of Independence, and that flag up behind me there is one of those flags. Is a flag that represents Māori independence and states that Māori should govern themselves. And we also have the Treaty of Waitangi, which is recognised by the New Zealand government. And basically that says that Māori did not cede sovereignty and that we do have certain rights. Some of the key aspects of the Treaty of Waitangi in terms of digital AI, algorithms, biases, etc., is that the treaty itself gives Māori the right to control their own taonga or treasure. So we've identified that data is a treasure, therefore the New Zealand government is bound by the Treaty of Waitangi with data. So furthermore, the treaty offers three key principles that the New Zealand government is bound by. That's the right for Māori and the government to co-design, co-govern and co-manage projects and anything of benefit to Māori. And the government's also required to ensure equity for Māori. So of course, a lot of the racists and non-Māori say, well, how can data be a taonga? So from our traditional stories talk about all the data in the world being taken by one of our deities from in the higher realms of the spirit world and brought down to earth. So that gives all data genealogy to our creators. So that's the first aspect of acknowledging that data is a treasure. From a Māori point of view, anything that I touch, this Zoom conference, a photo, has a part of my life essence in it. So from a Māori point of view, everyone who's interacting with me right now has a part of my Māori, part of my life force. And that's also sacred. So that's also a treasure. So our data, regardless of whether it's been anonymized or not, has a Māori in it, it has a life force. So this has led us to the Māori staunch advocates for Māori data sovereignty, very similar to Indigenous data sovereignty or countries' sovereignty of their own data. We've got a movement to push for Māori data sovereignty. So where we have any data that's either biological or digital or in any format, any information that is about Māori, by Māori, or for Māori, should fall under Māori data sovereignty principles. And so those Māori data sovereignty principles rely on the two founding documents of New Zealand, He Whakaputanga, the Treaty of Waitangi, and of course the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It considers all of those and forces our government to accept that Māori data sovereignty must be considered. So at the moment, we've got some government departments recognise Māori data sovereignty. There's a number of other government departments that are saying, well, how do we sort this out? What do we do? We've got other government departments who recognise that data is a taonga. And so there's a significant step going forward to address Māori data sovereignty. Now, one of the key benefits for Māori, as in America and Australia, our New Zealand police force has been researched, and we know that the police force have physical biases against Māori. That's no question. So we also now have facial recognition systems being brought over here that are not tested on Māori, not tested on our Pacific peoples, but they're tested on European, Caucasian men and women. So using the Treaty of Waitangi Māori data sovereignty principles, we're applying pressure on the New Zealand police to actually seriously consider their facial recognition systems. And the New Zealand police have actually been quite proactive in addressing those biases and working with academics and with Māori to try and figure out how to stop those biases. We also have very strict privacy laws in New Zealand compared to, say, the States or Australia. So a principle of Māori data sovereignty is that our data should not leave our shores. So unfortunately at the moment, the key rebuttal to that is it's too expensive to host data in New Zealand. But we're seeing Amazon, Microsoft bringing data centers over here. And we're seeing a New Zealand company trying to set up data storage over here as well. Back in 2002, Māori realised that the internet was designed for non-Māori. They totally ignored Māori with everything. So a group of us petitioned to have our own representative domain name, .maori.nz. Now, the reason we did this is because unlike a lot of other Indigenous peoples in the world, we don't have an identifier on the internet to make the internet ours. And the bias and the abuse and the bullying by senior members of the New Zealand tech community was absolutely horrifying. We were blocked at every step, and I guess it's probably only been up until about maybe a year ago where that organisation is actually starting to recognise Māori obligations and rights, and the fact that we have a lot of online abuse of our Indigenous peoples. In New Zealand, we also have a largely government and community funded organisation that deals with online abuse. And we also have New Zealand legislation that makes online abuse illegal. The problem with that legislation is it wasn't co-designed with Māori. So it's very Eurocentric, and it's almost impossible to claim or to prove that you've been abused or harassed online. And it also doesn't consider any race laws. You can be racist, you can make any sort of comments or send any images you want, but it's not against the law. So, so in one way, I guess a lot of Indigenous peoples could look at New Zealand and think we're very progressive and we've got lots of protections. But I think from on the ground here, we've still got a long way to go. And I guess like with everyone else, it will involve proper partnerships and co-design with Indigenous peoples to identify how best to prevent those biases. And I think that was 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Karaitiana. That's been really insightful, and it demonstrates the differences from Australia and New Zealand about the having those treaties, having those founding documents that give some leverage that we don't actually have. I want to just hand it back to Bronwyn and Sofiya. Is there any few comments that you would like to make in light of the other discussion presentations?
Well, I'll just say quickly, one thing that is so apparent to me is how desperately we need sovereign rights models to proliferate into spaces where sovereign rights are profoundly contested, like in North America and other places. I think many colonized people, for example, do not, who are displaced around the world and kind of in a diaspora around the world, it has been very difficult for us to reach for sovereign rights models. In the United States, for example, Black people, LGBTQ people who are not Indigenous reach for civil rights models or human rights models for rights-based protections, but there are profound limits also to those. And I think what I think the possibility is so much more, kind of cross-continental kinds of research and possibilities and frameworks that we need to help stand up. Because as I look out, I see so many different kinds of commissions and boards and people trying to talk about rights-based models and protections for the public, but they really don't center the kinds of principles that the two of you are talking about. And so, like, how do we take the evidence of the profound disproportionate harms that come to our communities and then negotiate and implement the kinds of much broader kinds of paradigm shifting protections that I think we're talking about today.
Thank you, Safira. Bronwyn, did you have any words that you wanted to say?
Just to thank both of the other speakers for their comments, and I often think about how they actually, how some of that stuff could or is useful here in Australia. One of the issues for us, and there's a growing movement here for treaty and treaty negotiations, but Aboriginal people, that's a category that doesn't actually exist. There's no Aboriginal people. There are nations of people within this continent where engagement with those sovereign peoples need to be had in terms of treaty. And so this idea of asking the white Australian government and the Crown to engage in treaty is really an interesting one here that is not actually one that is considered a model that people really want to pursue. It really ought to be the other way around, where non-Indigenous people need to engage with local people in terms of a treaty of being on country and sovereignty of place. So it's interesting, but I do see some movement there, and there's a lot of Indigenous people fighting in spaces for treaty here. Being one of the only places that doesn't actually have a treaty with colonizers sets Indigenous people here at a massive disadvantage to many other nations around the world also. So here, Indigenous rights is not enshrined anywhere in any government level. And so we are really quite powerless in that sense. We, of course, have agency and exert that power in other ways, but in that sense, within this legal system, it leaves us at a major disadvantage. And when we're talking about the tech world, we have no protections there.
Yeah, it's really important what you're saying, because so many of the tech companies really are operating as if they are nation states themselves, right? And so how will we contend with, curb, contain, roll back, redress their posture and positions and their impositions? And that could be a real opportunity, in the sense that there have not been, there are so many struggles around doing that with different nation states. But if the tech companies assume the posture of nation state, then I think that seems like a really, something worth talking about more and thinking about more.